Far the Midnight Midwife of 1884's Why No Child Survived Her Georgia Clinic, she was known as the Midnight Midwife. In 1884, in a small Georgia town whose name history has nearly forgotten, women would walk for miles through pine forests and red clay roads to reach her door. They came in the dark of night, often alone, sometimes bleeding, always terrified. They came because there was no one else. And they left, if they left at all, carrying babies that wouldn't see their first birthday. This is the story of how one woman's clinic became a place of desperation, loss, and ultimately, a symbol of a crisis that the state of Georgia tried desperately to hide. And the question that haunts the historical record: why did no child survive her care? To understand what happened in that clinic, we must first understand the world into which these children were born. Georgia in 1884 was a state in transition. The Civil War was less than 20 years in the past. Reconstruction had ended, and the Jim Crow era was beginning to harden into law. For the majority of the state's black population, and for many poor white families as well, life was defined by poverty, isolation, and a near-total absence of medical care. Infant mortality rates in 1884 were staggering. In some Georgia communities, more than 26 out of every 100 children born would die before their first birthday. For the children of the poor, the rate was even higher. There were no hospitals in most rural counties. There were few doctors, and even fewer who would travel into the backwoods to attend a birth. Social reformers writing in 1914 described mothers who went through pregnancy without any medical aid whatever, and homes where babies were fed sausage and chocolate candy in the first month of life. This was not malice. It was ignorance born of isolation. These people loved their children and wanted to be wise parents, but had not yet learned to relate to their children the principles of inheritance, of environment, of selection, and of upgrading which they applied to the raising of other crops. For these women, the only option was the local midwife. In the black communities of the South, these women were known as granny midwives. They were keepers of an ancient tradition, knowledge that had survived the Middle Passage, passed down from mother to daughter, from grandmother to granddaughter. They knew herbs, they knew positions, they knew how to catch babies. But in 1884, the granny midwives were under attack. The medical establishment, almost entirely white and male, had begun a campaign to delegitimize them. Doctors argued that childbirth was a medical event, a state of disease and unnaturalness that required the intervention of trained professionals. The fact that most of these midwives were black women who had learned their craft from their mothers was, to them, proof of their inadequacy. White doctors testified before legislative committees that these women were untrained, uneducated, and unsanitary. They were a menace to the health of mothers and infants. They demanded regulation. They demanded licensing. They demanded, ultimately, to eliminate them entirely. But here is the truth they did not want to admit in 1884. Doctors were not saving babies either. The infant mortality rate in areas served by physicians was often as high as in areas served by midwives. The difference was that when a baby died under a midwife's care, it was blamed on her ignorance. When a baby died under a doctor's care, it was blamed on the disease. Our Midnight Midwife was not the first woman to practice midwifery in Georgia. She was one of thousands. But she was one of the few who had the audacity to open a dedicated clinic, a place where women could come to give birth rather than delivering alone in the fields or in their cabins. They called her the Midnight Midwife because she worked through the night. Birth does not wait for dawn, and in a world without electric light or reliable medicine, the darkness was the most dangerous time. She worked by candle and lantern, her hands guided by instinct and the knowledge of generations. She was a good woman. She helped everybody. White ladies, black ladies, did not matter. If you were having a baby, she was there. But the babies did not always make it. That was not her fault. It was just the way things was. But the record shows that something was different about this clinic. The death rate was higher than the average for the region. Much higher. The archives are incomplete, a common problem for this era, particularly for records concerning black communities, but the fragments that survive paint a grim picture. In 1884, the infant mortality rate across Georgia was high. In some counties, for every 1,000 live births, 164 infants died in the first year. That is nearly 1 in 6. But at the Midnight Midwife's clinic, the numbers were worse. Much worse. According to the surviving records, and these records are controversial, collected by a state health department that was eager to discredit midwives, no child born in her care survived the year. No child survived. Think about what that means. For every mother who walked through her door, for every cry of a newborn infant, for every swaddled bundle that was carried home into the Georgia night, not one of those children lived to see their first birthday. Why? The answer is not simple, and it is not as obvious as the medical establishment of the time wanted to believe. Let us look at the conditions these children were born into. The clinic itself was located in a remote area, what social workers later called the southernmost extension of the Blue Ridge Mountain Belt, a region so isolated that some homes visited could not be reached even by wagon, and had to be sought out by trail over mountains and through streams. For the Midnight Midwife's patients, reaching the clinic was only the first challenge. Many of these women were malnourished. They had worked in the fields through most of their pregnancies. They had little access to clean water or proper nutrition. Their bodies were already depleted before labor began. Lack of medical skill, poor nursing, unwise feeding, all contributed to this end. Add to this the underfed, overworked condition of the mother, the drudgery, monotony, dullness of her life, and it is not strange that her children came into the world handicapped in vigor and vitality. The clinic itself was not a hospital. There was no running water, no sterile equipment, no heat in the winter. The procedures that doctors were beginning to use in urban hospitals, hand washing, antiseptic practices, forceps deliveries, were unavailable here. Even if the midwife had known about them, she lacked the means to implement them. But here is the question that the doctors of the era did not want to answer. Would a trained physician have done any better? The evidence suggests that in many cases, the answer was no. The infant mortality rate in doctors' practices was comparable. The difference was that doctors could write their failures off as natural causes. Midwives could not. The campaign against midwives was not primarily about saving babies. It was about control. It was about replacing the knowledge of women with the authority of men. It was about professionalizing medicine in a way that excluded black women. And in 1884, in rural Georgia, it was about scapegoating the people who were doing the work that no one else would do. State officials in Georgia coined a term for this. They called it the midwife problem. But as one historian has argued, there was no problem attributed to the birthing practices of midwives. The problem was that these women were black, they were poor, they were rural, and they were in the way of a new vision of medicine that had no place for them. The Midnight Midwife's clinic closed. We do not know exactly when or exactly why. The records trail off into silence, but her story did not end. It became a cautionary tale, an example that the state used to justify the licensing and regulation of midwives. By the 1920s, the state of Georgia had begun to require midwives to be licensed. They had to pass exams, attend classes, and meet standards set by the health department. In many ways, this was progress. It brought some hygienic practices and some accountability to the profession, but it also had the effect of reducing the number of midwives dramatically. In 1900, midwives attended half of all births in America. By the middle of the 20th century, that number had plummeted. In Georgia, the state went from having approximately 9,000 granny midwives to just a fraction of that number. And the result was not better care for poor women. It was no care at all. What is remarkable is that when the state finally began to train midwives, the experience transformed both the teachers and the students. One account describes how white nurses, who came to teach hygiene and sanitation to black midwives, ended up learning something themselves. They learned the dignity of simplicity, the power of group thinking, and a kindness to unmarried women. The tradition had value. The knowledge had value. And it was almost lost. There were survivors of the crackdown. Beatrice Borders, a black midwife in Camilla, Georgia, opened her own birthing center in the 1940s. The Georgia Williams Nursing Home. She delivered over 6,000 babies in a 30-year career, often charging only $25, sometimes accepting payments in chickens, hogs, and vegetables. She was respected by the community, honored by the city, and she kept the tradition alive. But Beatrice Borders was the exception. Most of the midnight midwives, the women who had worked through the night to catch babies in the Georgia countryside, were forgotten. Their names, their stories, their skills, all lost to history. So what do we make of the Midnight Midwife of 1884? Was she a killer of children, as the state's authorities implied? Or was she a victim of circumstances beyond her control? A woman who did her best in an impossible situation and was then blamed for the poverty and inequality that surrounded her. The record is incomplete. We do not know her name. We do not know exactly how many children died or what they died of. We do not know the truth of what happened inside that clinic. What we do know is that she existed, that she was a real woman, a real midwife, in a real Georgia town, trying to help women give birth in conditions that would have broken anyone. And we know that the children she failed, the children that no one saved, were not just statistics. They were real. They were loved. They were wanted. They were carried home by mothers who had walked for miles in the dark, hoping that this time would be different. Maybe the real question is not, why did no child survive? Maybe the real question is, why did we let it happen? Why did we let generations of women and children die in the shadows of poverty and neglect? Why did we blame the women who were trying to help, rather than the system that left them with nothing? Between 1900 and 1950, infant mortality in the United States dropped by nearly 80%. Not because midwives were eliminated, but because poverty was reduced, sanitation improved, and basic health care became available. Georgia did not see a significant drop in infant mortality until the 1930s, and rural areas lagged decades behind. Today, infant mortality among black babies in Georgia is still more than twice that of white babies. A legacy of the inequality that the Midnight Midwife story represents. The Midnight Midwife of 1884 is gone. Her clinic is gone. But the conditions that created her, the poverty, the isolation, the lack of care, are not entirely gone. As we look at the numbers, and as we look at the faces of those who are still left behind, we have to ask, what will we learn from her story? And what will we do, this time, to make it different? There is a spiritual that has been sung in the South for generations, a song that captures the sorrow and the hope of mothers who have lost their children. It is called "Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child." The lyrics speak of a long journey, a weariness, a longing for home. That song could have been sung by any of the women who walked to the Midnight Midwife's clinic. carrying their babies home in the darkness, hoping against hope that this time would be different. They were not motherless. They were mothers. And their children were not forgotten. They are remembered in the soil of Georgia, in the red clay that holds the bones of so many who died too soon. They are remembered in the stories that were passed down from grandmother to granddaughter. The stories of a woman who worked by candlelight, doing what she could with what she had. We do not know her name, but we know her work. We know that she was there when no one else was. We know that she held the hands of terrified women and told them they were not alone. We know that she caught their babies and wrapped them in whatever cloth she could find and prayed with them over those tiny bodies. And we know that those babies died, not because she was evil, not because she was ignorant, but because the world they were born into was a world of poverty, of neglect, of a system that did not care whether they lived or died. The doctors who denounced her did not come to the countryside to deliver babies. The hospitals that refused to admit black mothers did not offer their services to the poor. The state that blamed her for the deaths of infants did nothing to prevent those deaths. She was a scapegoat. She was a convenient target for a medical establishment that wanted to eliminate competition. She was a symbol of everything they wanted to destroy: the knowledge of women, the traditions of black communities, the independence of people who had survived centuries of oppression and still found ways to care for each other. But she was also a real woman, with real hands, a real heart, a real life. She was someone's daughter, someone's mother, someone's grandmother. She lived in a time when being a black woman in the South meant being at the bottom of a brutal hierarchy. She had no rights that anyone was bound to respect. She had no voice in the government that regulated her profession. She had no access to the education that would have allowed her to defend herself against her accusers. And yet she opened a clinic. She offered her services to anyone who needed them. She worked through the night, through the cold, through the exhaustion, because there were women who had no one else. She was not a perfect midwife. She made mistakes. She lost babies. But she also saved mothers. She also provided comfort. She also kept a tradition alive that had sustained black families for generations. We cannot judge her by the standards of modern medicine. We cannot impose our knowledge on her world. We can only try to understand her world, to see the conditions she faced, to recognize the courage it took to do what she did. And we can honor her memory by acknowledging that the system that failed her, and failed the babies who died in her care, is not a relic of the past. It is still with us. It is still killing babies. It is still blaming mothers. It is still denying care to the poor, the black, the rural, the forgotten. The infant mortality rate for black babies in Georgia today is still more than twice the rate for white babies. That is not because of genetics. That is not because of any inherent difference between races. That is because of poverty, because of lack of access to health care, because of the lingering effects of centuries of systemic racism. And there are still women in rural Georgia who have to travel miles to reach a hospital. There are still women who give birth without adequate prenatal care. There are still women who lose their babies because the system does not care about them. We can learn from the Midnight Midwife story. We can learn that blaming the people who are trying to help is not the same as helping. We can learn that licensing and regulation, without access and support, does not save lives. We can learn that the most important thing is not who delivers the baby, but whether the mother and child have what they need to survive. The Midnight Midwife of 1884 is a ghost. She haunts the history of Georgia, of the South, America. She reminds us of what we have lost, of what we have failed to do. of what we still need to do. She asks us to look at the numbers, to see the faces, to hear the cries, and to ask ourselves, what are we going to do about it? Her story is not just a story about the past. It is a story about the present. It is a story about the future. It is a story about whether we will finally learn the lesson that we should have learned long ago, that every child matters, every mother matters, and that we have a responsibility to care for each other, no matter who we are, no matter where we live, no matter how poor we are. The Midnight Midwife is gone, but her work is not done. There are still babies to be born. There are still mothers to be supported. There are still lives to be saved. The question is not whether we can do it. The question is whether we will do it. Whether we will finally create a world where no mother has to walk through the dark, alone and afraid, hoping that her child will survive. That is the legacy of the Midnight Midwife of 1884. That is the question she leaves us. And that is the challenge we must answer. 2. There is one more thing that needs to be said about the Midnight Midwife. We do not know her name, but we do know something about her character. We know that she was trusted by her community. We know that women came to her from miles around, often walking through the night, often bringing whatever they could offer in payment. We know that she never turned anyone away, no matter how poor, no matter how sick, no matter how hopeless the case. That is not the mark of a woman who did not care. That is the mark of a woman who cared deeply. That is the mark of a woman who took on burdens that should have been borne by the larger society. That is the mark of a woman who sacrificed her own comfort, her own safety, her own reputation to help others. And what happened to her? She was vilified. She was blamed. She was used as a cautionary tale to justify the destruction of her profession. She became a symbol of everything that the medical establishment wanted to eliminate. But she also became a symbol of something else. She became a symbol of resistance. She became a symbol of community. She became a symbol of the power of women to care for each other, even in the face of overwhelming odds. That is why her story matters, not because she was perfect, not because she was a saint, but because she was human, because she tried, because she failed, because she kept trying anyway. The Midnight Midwife of 1884 is not a hero in the traditional sense. She is not a triumphant figure. She is a tragic figure. She is a reminder of what happens when a society abandons its most vulnerable members. She is a reminder of what happens when we let poverty, racism, and neglect determine who lives and who dies. But she is also a reminder of what is possible. She is a reminder of the power of one person to make a difference. She is a reminder that even in the darkest times, there are people who will reach out to help, who will work through the night, who will do what they can with what they have. She is a reminder that we all have a choice. We can choose to look away. We can choose to blame the victims. We can choose to let the system continue to fail the most vulnerable among us. Or we can choose to act. We can choose to care. We can choose to create a world where no mother has to walk through the dark, alone and afraid, hoping that her child will survive. That is the choice before us. That is the legacy of the Midnight Midwife of 1884. That is the question she leaves us. And that is the challenge we must answer, not just for her sake, but for the sake of all the mothers and children who are still waiting for a better world. In the end, the story of the Midnight Midwife of 1884 is not just a story about one woman, one clinic, one town. It is a story about America. It is a story about the gap between our ideals and our realities. It is a story about the promise of equality and the failure to fulfill that promise. It is a story about the power of community and the tragedy of neglect. It is a story that asks us to look at ourselves, to look at our society, to look at our values, and to ask whether we are really living up to what we claim to believe. It asks us whether we are really doing everything we can to protect the most vulnerable among us. It asks us whether we are really willing to sacrifice our comfort, our convenience, our privileges, to create a world where every child has a chance to survive. The Midnight Midwife of 1884 did not have the answer to that question. She could only do her best with what she had. But she did something more important than finding an answer. She lived the question. She embodied the struggle. She showed us what it means to try, even when the odds are against you, even when the system is against you, even when the world is against you. And that is why we remember her. That is why we tell her story. That is why we will not let her be forgotten, because her story is our story. Her struggle is our struggle. Her question is our question. And until we answer that question, until we create a world where no mother has to walk through the dark alone and afraid, we will keep telling her story. We will keep remembering her. We will keep trying to do better. The Midnight Midwife of 1884 is gone, but her spirit lives on in everyone who refuses to look away, everyone who refuses to accept the unacceptable, everyone who is willing to work through the night to help someone in need. She was a woman who did what she could with what she had. She was a woman who tried to make a difference in a world that was determined to break her. She was a woman who, in the end, was broken by that world. But she was not defeated. Her story is not a story of defeat. It is a story of endurance. It is a story of resistance. It is a story of hope. And as long as we remember her, as long as we tell her story, as long as we learn from her example, she will never truly be gone. She will live on in the hearts of all those who care about justice, all those who care about equality, all those who care about the lives of mothers and children. The Midnight Midwife of 1884, Why No Child Survived Her Georgia Clinic. The answer is not simple. The answer is not easy. The answer is not comfortable. But the answer is important. And the answer is this: no child survived because the system failed them. No child survived because the world was not ready to protect them. No child survived because poverty, racism, and neglect are the real killers. And until we face that truth, until we change that reality, children will continue to die. Mothers will continue to grieve. And the Midnight Midwife will continue to haunt us, a reminder of what we have failed to do, a challenge to do better, a call to action that we cannot ignore. That is her legacy. That is her gift to us. That is the question she leaves us. And it is up to us to answer it.